Good afternoon or morning. My name is Brad Toben. I'm the Dean of Baylor Law School. I am pleased to introduce the keynote speaker for this conference, Professor David B. Wilkins, who today will be delivering the Bracewell LLP Distinguished Lecture in Racial and Social Justice. At Harvard Law School, Professor Wilkins is the Lester Kissel Professor of Law, the Vice Dean for Global Initiatives on the Legal Profession, and the Faculty Director of the Center on the Legal Profession. Professor Wilkins, an alumnus of Harvard Law School, clerk for Judge Wilfred Feinberg of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Second Circuit, and for the legendary Justice Thurgood Marshall of the United States Supreme Court. Professor Wilkins is a globally recognized authority in legal ethics and structures, norms, and practices of the legal profession. He has written over 80 articles on the legal profession and is in leading scholarly journals and in the popular press. He is the co-editor or author of 5 books, including one of the leading case books in the field of lawyering and the legal profession. Professor Wilkins teaches courses on lawyers and lawyering, including the legal profession, the challenges of a general counsel, and leadership in law firms. He has given over 50 endowed lectures at universities around the world and is a frequent speaker at professional conferences, in law firms, and at corporate retreats. Professor Wilkins is also a recipient of a panoply of awards, recognitions, and honorary degrees, and he is an elected fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. We are delighted to welcome Professor Wilkins, a genuinely distinguished lawyer, scholar, and public intellectual, to deliver the Bracewell LLP Distinguished Lecture in Racial and Social Justice. Professor Wilkins.
Thank you so much, Dean Toben, and thank you, Dean Baines, for organizing this important event, and thank you to Bracewell for sponsoring this lecture. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, something that all of you are getting familiar with in the Zoom world. I understand that I've already been put in side-by-side mode, and I've got some data and some other things I hope will be interesting here. So let me start here. George Floyd, that's what has brought much of us together here today. And a little over 4 months ago, Mayor Sylvester Turner stood at the pulpit of the Fountain of Praise Church in Houston, Texas, where I wish we all were today, but we're all virtually there today, to help the city say goodbye to its native son, George Floyd. In his speech that day, Mayor Turner announced that immediately upon his return to City Hall, he would be signing an executive order banning the use of the kinds of chokeholds that killed Mr. Floyd. But Mayor Turner also made clear that the response to Mr. Floyd's murder must go beyond policing, as he said, and that he had been talking to business leaders and CEOs, and he was telling them that, quote, when we invest in communities that have been underserved and underinvested in, then you don't have to invest so much in policing. And in proclaiming June 9th, 2020, George Perry Floyd Day in the city of Houston, the mayor made clear that he was being honored not because he was perfect, but, quote, because he took his last breath so that we will all be able to breathe. Today, Dean Leonard Baines has used his pulpit as the dean of this great law school to convene a distinguished group of academics, practitioners, policymakers, judges, to breathe much needed life into the effort to bring diversity and inclusion to the legal profession. It is, to paraphrase Lyndon Johnson's statement when he was nominating my old boss, Thurgood Marshall, to the Supreme Court, the right thing to do, the right time to do it, the right place, and the right people. The University of Houston Law Center sits in Houston's 3rd Ward, just a few blocks from the public housing where Mr. Floyd was raised. And just like the 3 other legends whose photographs are featured alongside Justice Marshall's on the program for this important gathering. And I want to mention them because they need to be mentioned. Professor Lonnie Guinier, my colleague, whose brilliant book, The Miner's Canary, taught us long before George Floyd that if left unchecked, the toxins that threaten Black Americans with stopping breathing will eventually suffocate this entire country. Former Attorney General Eric Holder, another dear friend, whose continuing work against voter suppression has never been more important as we enter the weekend before the most consequential presidential election of our lifetime. And last but certainly not least, the indomitable Representative Barbara Jordan, who my best friend, Professor Anthony Chase, who sits on this distinguished faculty, introduced me to shortly after she gave the speech at the Democratic National Convention in 1976 that transformed politics for all time and laid the groundwork for the election of President Obama 32 years later. Just like these three great Black lawyers, Dean Baines and Mayor Turner, who Tony and I have to say, we are proud to say was our classmate at Harvard Law School, are the lineal descendants of the great Charles Hamilton Houston, who charged all Black lawyers with being, quote, social engineers for justice. And the world has never needed great social engineers for justice more than it does today. Look, we are in the midst of not one, not two, but three related and deep crises, right? We have a global public health crisis because of COVID, which has created an increasingly global economic crisis. And finally, we are seeing an increasingly global call for social and racial justice. All three have exposed deep structural issues that, as Harvard business and in fact university professor Rebecca Henderson has argued in a very important new book, that these challenges have already, quote, set the world on fire. And they will last long after the current sense of urgency has faded. And all three of these changes and the resulting challenges, I submit, have major implications for the legal profession and for our efforts to achieve diversity within it. So, all we have to do is look around. The rapid rate at which the virus and then the economic slowdown and now the protests have spread around the world underscore just how interconnected we all are. And yet we have also seen the differences in the response to these shocks from country to country, from state to state, even city to city, have underscored just how important local conditions and leadership still are. And we are seeing countries and even companies moving to both insulate critical aspects of their supply chains from globalization, even as they continue to serve global markets. It's not global, it's also local, or glocal, as I like to say, just smushing global and local together. This new world has important implications for diversity. First, global growth has slowed, driving down the overall demand for legal services. There's a brilliant study by Acritas, which is now a part of Thomson Reuters, that already has shown in the first 2 quarters, demand for legal services is down 9%. And we know that diversity traditionally suffers in a downturn. Think last hired, first fired. But there's also opportunity here. My brother is a partner in New York. We did a wonderful webinar together like this a couple of weeks ago on race, sustainability, and social justice. He's the global partner in charge of sustainability, but he also sits on New York City's Economic Planning Board. And he pointed out that New York has created something called the Circular City Initiative, in part to protect New York City's supply chains from global shocks. And this is providing new opportunities for minority, women, and Black-owned enterprises because they are less susceptible to the kinds of global shocks that are disrupting the supply chains generally. And many companies are realizing that they need to prioritize the close to $1.5 trillion of purchasing power of Black consumers. Second, technology. You know, I've given a lot of lectures on this, and before 7 or 8 months ago, you had to convince lawyers that technology was going to be an important part of their lives and affect their practices. Now, we're all living our lives on Zoom. And no one thinks that things are going to go back to the way they were before in terms of the way we work, even after there is hopefully a vaccine. Just look at what Facebook and Twitter and many of the tech companies are saying. But also look at Linklaters, a kind of dyed-in-the-wool UK law firm, has said something like 60% of its people are going to continue to work from home in substantial measure, even after the COVID crisis is over. And this is just the beginning. And once again, technology and the rise of work from home have important implications for diversity. The problem's not with the quality of the work. In fact, that's one of the things that we're learning. There's some of you may have seen this big National Law Journal survey, very big survey, and they found that 92% of all lawyers they surveyed, including managing partners and general counsels, agreed that they are continuing to provide excellent service to clients, and most of the general counsels and clients I talked to agree. And technology, we also know, can have an equalizing or a democratizing effect. Again, Acritas has found that 77% of the lawyers that they survey want to continue to work remotely at least 2 days a week. And this is particularly true for women, who are more likely, 42% to 31%, to say that they've seen improvements in the working environment and their own work as they have moved to work from home. But we also know that law firms, in-house legal departments, and other organizations are struggling to find ways to build community and collaboration online, and even more, to avoid burnout. As a friend of mine said to me a couple of weeks ago, I'm not working from home. I'm sleeping at work. It's very hard to draw the boundaries. It's very hard to separate when everything is in the same place. And once again, these issues are likely to disproportionately affect diverse lawyers who already have difficulties building relationships, gaining access to informal networks, and juggling multiple commitments. Commitments that have become even more acute, both at home with family responsibilities, at work, and in the community at large. Third, even before the current crisis, lawyers were increasingly being asked to solve problems at the intersection of law and business and strategy and technology and politics. And the current crisis is only going to accentuate this demand. Just think of the kind of new legal work that's going to be created out of our current situation. There is already an explosion of new laws, programs, redesigned institutions, everything from the payroll protection plan to contact tracing to online courts. Or how about this? How many existing corporate policies and practices are going to have to be redesigned around employment, online work, supply chains, data privacy and security? Or how much reorganization is going to have to go on in the economy, whether through bankruptcy and restructuring or strategic acquisitions? Or the explosion in public-private partnerships in areas like healthcare, pharmaceuticals, education. And at the global level, we're seeing a huge increase in compacts, audits, sustainability regulation, laws against modern slavery in the supply chain in the UK and California. Yes, this will be good for lawyers, to be honest. The overall demand for lawyers is going to increase, I have no doubt. But clients will increasingly demand that lawyers who serve them go beyond simply providing a legal service to help them create integrated solutions that put together broader business and strategic imperatives. And that this changing understanding of what counts as a business imperative will only accentuate this trend. So listen, most of you know this famous quote from the economist Milton Friedman, who said in 1970, so 50 years ago, that the social responsibility of business is to increase its profits, pure and simple. Maybe nobody followed this strictly, but this was the dominant ethos of capitalism, not just here in America, but around the world. Even before COVID, this taken for granted presumption had been dramatically questioned. 2018, BlackRock, the world's largest asset manager, declared that it would, quote, look beyond the bottom line to invest in businesses that, quote, contribute to society. The Business Roundtable, you don't get any more blue blood business than that, followed by amending its definition of the purpose of a corporation to include duties to all of the company's stakeholders, including customers and employees and suppliers, and even the community in which the companies are located. And in January of 2020, again, before we knew the extent of the COVID crisis, BlackRock issued a second letter that it would immediately stop investing in companies that present, quote, a high sustainability related risk. By highlighting the deep structural inequalities in everything from healthcare to employment, the COVID crisis and the related crises will only accelerate this trend. And if you have any doubt about that, in July of this year, the World Economic Forum, even more blue blood corporate than the Business Roundtable, declared that there needed to be a, quote, great reset of capitalism in the wake of the pandemic. Yes, I believe green is becoming the new black. For those of you who used to watch Orange is the New Black, you know where I got that from. But now it's clear there's more. So since the murder of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, it is now clear that racial and social justice must be a part of this broader sustainability agenda. And corporate America is increasingly putting real resources behind this commitment. So not surprisingly, it started with statements and symbols, albeit important ones, like NASCAR banning the stars and bars and Princeton taking Woodrow Wilson's name off the Woodrow Wilson School, even Mississippi taking the stars and bars off the state flag. But it's gone a lot further. So in the last several months, there have been close to $3 billion pledged to racial justice organizations by leading companies such as GM, Home Depot, AT&T, State Farm. I could name many more. Perhaps even more significantly, there's been a huge increase in commitments to supplier diversity programs, over $2 billion from companies like Coca-Cola, $500 million, PayPal, $550 million, Pepsi, $400 million, Apple, $100 million. Sephora, the retailer chain, said 15% of its shelf space is going to go to Black and other minority-owned products. Microsoft pledged to double its minority suppliers. Maybe even more interesting, there's been an explosion in social justice investing. Many of you probably saw Alphabet, the parent company of Google, just issued a $5.7 billion sustainability bond, which includes $175 million to Black-owned businesses, $100 million to promote minority creators and artists. Bank of America has pledged $1 billion in lending to minority and underserved communities. SoftBank, one of the leading venture capitalists in the world, has created a $100 million venture fund to support minority entrepreneurs. At the board level, even before the crisis, Goldman Sachs declared that it was no longer going to support IPOs that had all male boards. And just recently, Legal and General Investment Management, which many of you know is a very important player in this space, said that in 2022, they were going to vote against any slate of directors for a FTSE 100 or an S&P 500 company that did not have a Black, Asian, or ethnic minority director. At least you think this is just a passing fad. California and Canada are considering legal mandates for racial diversity on boards that parallel what we've already seen in Europe around diversity, around gender diversity on boards. And in the hiring level, BlackRock and Adidas pledged to increase Black hiring 30% in 5 years. Wells Fargo said it was going to double Black leadership in 5 years. Dell promised 15% of its senior leaders were going to be Black by 2030. Microsoft and Google were going to double the number of Black managers in 5 years. So if green is the new black, maybe black is the new green. And look what's happening under our eyes that's going to reinforce this trend. We spent a lot of time talking about millennials, but one of the little known noticed fact of 2020 is that the first Gen Zs graduated from college this year. I have to say, when I saw that, I said, that can't possibly be right. But the first Gen Zs were born in 1998. 22 years later, they are graduating from college. And when you put them together with millennials, they're not just a new fad. They're already 38% of the workforce. And they're going to be over 50% of the workforce in a little more than a decade. And we know a few things about this new generation. One, as my colleague John Palfrey, actually he's not my colleague anymore, he now is running the MacArthur Foundation because he's a genius. He wrote in a book way back in 2008 that this generation was born digital, meaning all the things that you and I are struggling with and learning how to use in Zoom, it is second nature and they are not going to go back. But equally, if not more important, they are increasingly seeking meaning and purpose in their lives. And I have no doubt that the pandemic and the protests will only heighten these dual commitments. And this is critically important for lawyers because our recruitment into the profession, into our organizations, and our retention of talent depends upon us making the claim that we are a public profession, that we have a kind of legitimacy and credibility that other occupations that talented people could go into don't have. But to demonstrate that legitimacy, we are going to have to address our own diversity problem in a much more serious way than we have before. So let's not forget those original social engineers, right? It was Black lawyers who first established the connection between social justice and law, right? It wasn't until Houston and Marshall's step-by-step litigation campaign in Brown versus Board of Education that we rescued the promise of American democracy from the sin and hypocrisy of slavery and Jim Crow. And again, I recommend everybody go back and read Richard Kluger's great book, Simple Justice. But let's also remember this. for the first 10 years after Brown, almost nothing happened. Another great book people should read is by the political scientist Gerald Rosenberg. It's called The Hollow Hope. And he documented that between 1954 and 1964, literally, there was almost no change in the integration of American society, particularly in elite institutions. Just like today, it took mass protests in the streets, led by, of course, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., but also the great John Lewis and Reverend C.T. Vivian, heroes who we tragically lost this year. It took protests in the streets with the support of Black lawyers to force change. And that change was dramatic. The Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, the Fair Housing Act of 1968. Those are the cornerstones of what has changed America today. And those laws, in turn, put pressure on all sectors of American society to finally desegregate, including, I'm going to argue, importantly, higher education. Look, there's been progress. I said higher education had barely budged. In 1965, Harvard Law School had, in the entering class of 1965, which was in 1962, it had one Black student, Conrad Harper. The same number of Black students it had in 1869, when George Lewis Ruffin became the first Black lawyer to receive legal education in the United States. And we know that, when people talk about the good old days, they're not talking about us, okay? So this is a quote from one of my favorite books about the legal profession. It was written by a sociologist named Erwin Spiegel, who did a very extensive study of Wall Street law firms in the late 1950s and early 1960s. He interviewed hundreds of lawyers. And this is what the definition of merit was in those Wall Street law firms. And they were pretty unabashed about it. He said, Wall Street law firms recruit men who are, quote, Nordic, have pleasing personalities and clean-cut appearances, are graduates of the right schools, have the right social background and experience in the affairs of the world, and are endowed with tremendous stamina. Okay. Things have changed, okay? Stamina is still important, but it's a good thing things have changed because there are not enough clean-cut Nordic guys to go around. And as I'm sure that the LSAC wonderful people who are with us today, Kelly Testy is doing a fantastic job there. In 2020, more than 50% of the law students are female and 30% are people of color, which is even more in law schools like my own. And if you consider other forms of diversity, including LGBTQ and people with disability, then the percentage is much higher. And, the US is on its way very quickly to be a majority minority country by 2045. But in states like California and Texas, where we all are virtually, that's going to happen a lot sooner. Okay. And every lawyer, whatever your practice is, has to learn how to operate in an increasingly diverse and global environment that will put a premium on cross-cultural fluency. Okay, yeah, there's been a lot of change. But sadly, we know that in this game, the more things change, the more they seem to stay the same. So over 2 decades ago, actually now almost 25 years ago, I wrote an article called Why Are There So Few Black Lawyers in Corporate Law Firms and Institutional Analysis. It was the first article in any major law journal to address this topic. And I wrote it because I wanted to understand this fact. More than 4 decades after Brown, Black lawyers still constituted less than 2% of the associates and less than 1% of the partners in the nation's top 250 law firms. Okay, there's been a lot of change since 1996, okay? Not the least of which has been the election of Barack Obama as the country's first Black president. And yet, after rising slowly for a decade or more, Black associates have fallen from about 4.6% to 3.9% since the Great Recession, so since 2009. And the number of Black partners has been stuck just around 2% since 2012. And many people think the real number is under 2%. And let's just be clear. In 2019, there were 7 firms in the top 100 that had 0 Black equity partners, and 20 of the top 100 only had 1. And while in-house legal departments, I know we have some general counsels and some folks from that world here, are doing somewhat better, no one is or should be satisfied with the progress that we have made in these last now almost 25 years. And here's the problem. Changes are likely to be even harder to come by. Why? Because law firms are changing. So when I wrote my article, most law firm recruiting was entry level out of law schools. Now it's mostly laterals. And we know that lateral recruitment has less process, greater emphasis on personal relationships, and the stakes are higher, all of which we can see is going to potentially have adverse effects for diversity. Look at retention, right? Used to be, I don't know, you had 5 or 6 years at a law firm before anybody would give you a serious review. Now, there is increasingly shorter time horizons, more hours pressure, and increased ambiguity about performance metrics. Again, all of this can potentially have quite negative effects for people who come in not knowing how the system works as well as some of their peers. And partnership, we used to say, it was just like tenure. And tenure, I like to say, and Dean Baines will agree with this, means never having to say you're sorry, which many of our colleagues take literally. Well, now, no one would say that about partnership. Every partner I know fears the knock on the door, right? Because there is an increased emphasis on short-term individual revenue generation. Again, things that can disproportionately impact Black lawyers. And in the company phase, in in-house legal departments, we used to say, well, that was the place, and it has shown more progress because in part it was the fastest growing part of the legal profession. But that growth is flat or declining. And actually over COVID, I think it's going to decline even further. And lawyers there are increasingly being pressed to do more for less. There's growing pressure on hours worked, and compensation structures are relatively flat, as are internal hierarchies. All of this is going to make making progress on diversity more difficult, as are changes in law school enrollment. Kelly knows this, and every dean knows this. Law school enrollment is down significantly from 2007, right? 140,000 entering law students to just over 10,000 in 2018. Rebounded a little bit. Some call it the Trump bump. We'll see what continues to happen, but that's a big decline, right? And who is going to law school is changing. So Goodwin Liu has written a brilliant article, which is about to come out in the UC Davis Law Review. And one of the things he shows is that the decline is much steeper in some groups than others, and particularly Asian Americans has declined 37.6%. And while Black enrollment is slightly up, if you look back to 2011, it's basically flat. And more than 50% of the Black students attend law schools that are ranked in tiers 4 and 5, or which are not ranked at all, where the legal job market is likely to be hit the hardest by the upcoming recession. And in all minority groups, and frankly, since 2016, Goodwin shows for all lawyers, the majority of law students, and for minorities, the overwhelming majority of law students, and for Black lawyers, this is particularly true, are women. And although this represents a triumph for gender inclusiveness, which we should celebrate, It also represents a challenge for a profession that remains gender challenged, particularly for women of color, who have all the problems that minority men have and all the problems that white women have, plus a unique combination of two. So we did a big study, which you can download off my website. I'm going to show you a little real data because I'm a data guy. We surveyed about 800 Black Harvard Law School alumni in 2016. And one of the things we were very interested in is what are the differences between Black women and Black men in their career trajectories? And this chart, I'll just point out the highlights here. This shows all the practice settings. I think you can see my cursor, right? These are all the practice settings. These are men, women overall. And then we divided the sample into pre and post 2000. Here's just a few things to notice. One, in terms of current jobs, men were wildly, statistically significantly more likely to be in private practice than Black women, even though they started out in private practice almost at exactly the same rates. And women, on the other hand, were significantly more likely to be in public interest in government. Can be a wonderful thing, is a wonderful thing, but we also know it pays less, it has less opportunities for advancement. And overall, whatever you think about this is not good news for those who are seeking to improve the dismal number of Black women advancing to partnership and leadership in law firms, since, as I said, Black women are the overwhelming majority of Black law students. And here's the last one I can't help but showing. So we asked people, were you satisfied with your own legal career? Would you still attend law school today, in other words? And would you recommend to a young person that they go to law school today? So first, a huge number of, these are all the Black, this is of Black Harvard Law School graduates. A huge number, 87, almost 90% of them said, yeah, I would go to law school today, notwithstanding all the challenges that I faced. But look at this. Only 66% of them would report that they would recommend it to a young person, even though they're satisfied with their own careers. And it gets worse. If you look at graduates post-2000 as opposed to pre-2000, the percentage drops who would recommend to a young person from 70% to 42%. And if you look at the difference between women and men, it's only 62% of women. Again, for a profession that is increasingly dominated, appropriately for many reasons, by Black women, these numbers are not good for the future of the legal profession. So here's where we are. There are kind of two possibilities, tale of two futures, tale of two cities, right? Here's the pessimistic story. I already alluded to it. Last hired, first fired. As low-end work disappears, minorities will be the first to go. At the same time, the 24/7 workday will increase pressure on women, which in turn adversely affects minorities. Again, the majority of minority law students are female. And this will be intensified by attrition, layoffs, mergers, and law firm failures. Okay? That's what I like to call the figure skating story. That's the story that we continue to think of merit in the way we've constructed it around the way in which we always have. But there's a different way to construct merit. And I like to say that's the difference between speed skating and figure skating. Some of you are old enough to remember the battle between Katarina Witt and Debbie Thomas for the Olympic gold medal. I think it was 88. Debbie Thomas was never going to beat Katarina Witt. Why? Because the French judge was never going to think she had the right balletic style. Her body type didn't look like the traditional ice princess, et cetera, et cetera. And you get scored on a subjective measure. On the other hand, I think it was the 2008 Olympics, maybe 2012, in speed skating, they line you up on the line, they shoot off the gun, and if a Black kid from the south side of Chicago named Shawnee Davis comes across the line first, he gets the gold medal. The question is there a different way to think about merit, right? And You see some evidence of this. Clients, particularly general counsels, are increasingly metric driven to achieve more for less. And therefore, they're saying we're decreasing our emphasis on traditional law firm relationships. And maybe we're only going to care about relationships where we can show that they confer real value. And that value is increasingly being determined through networks that span traditional boundaries. Question mark, question mark. What's going to determine this? Well, it's going to have a lot to do with what I like to call the Brown dividend. Many of the initiatives I've already talked about have been made possible by those who were given the opportunity to attend institutions of higher learning because of Brown and the civil rights movement, and who now, like Mayor Turner and Dean Baines, occupy senior positions with real power and authority. And while their numbers are still small, their voices are increasingly important, both in and of themselves and also in recruiting allies in the C-suite who see the unsustainability of what Henderson argues in her book is the model of, quote, extractive capitalism, where a smaller and smaller share at the top control an ever larger share of society resources, destabilizing the very markets and institutions that businesses ultimately need to survive. And it's clear, as I've already said, that the generation that's coming of age today will be even more insistent on linking sustainability and social justice. We see this in the general counsel suite. Back in 2009, General Mills General Counsel Rick Palmore and former ABA President Robert Gray created the Leadership Council on Legal Diversity to, quote, share information and craft incentives to promote diversity in legal departments and law firms. 2017, my former student, Kim Rivera, wrote what I like to call her "I'm mad as hell and I'm not taking it anymore" letter to law firms. She told them, if you don't meet your diversity goals, you'll forfeit 10% of your fees. In 2019, 170 general counsels signed a letter promising that we as a group will direct our substantial outside counsel spend to those law firms that manifest results with respect to diversity and inclusion. 2019, Advance Law, a network of 250 general counsels that share performance data on, quote, star lawyers, launched a diversity mentoring program to build relationship between rising diverse law firm associates and chief legal officers and other senior in-house lawyers. And in 2019, Diversity Lab, along with 25 GCs and 5 law firms and dozens of other industry thought leaders, launched the Move the Needle Project, promising to invest $5 million to test innovative initiatives to create a more diverse and inclusive legal profession. The pandemic and the protests will only increase this pressure as companies face mounting pressure, both externally and internally, to include racial justice, as I've argued before, as a key part of the broader sustainability agenda that they've been pushing pre-COVID-19. Law firms are doing their part too. According to a NALP survey, 99% of law firms have implemented at least one anti-racism initiative. We've seen statements, increased pro bono, anti-bias training. There's been a launching of new initiatives like the Law Firm Anti-Racism Alliance, and in the UK, a Racial Fairness Commitment Pledge. These are all important, but more will be required. To put it frankly, many of the programs we've tried before, and we know that a lot of them don't work nearly as well as we would like. I wrote a part of a book in 2016 that showed that no matter what they say, diversity is a second order priority for general counsels and hiring law firms. We have evidence that many traditional diversity programs actually fail because they activate bias rather than stamp it out. And we've seen many gender initiatives, like part-time work, don't focus on the real problem of the 24/7 culture that's disadvantaging women and minority women in particular. And finally, I know my friend Shaquan is on the program. He's seen this article. Russell Reynolds wrote a report that says chief diversity officers are often set up to fail by not being given the right resources. Look, Einstein said the definition of insanity is to do the same thing over and over again and expect a different result. So we got to stop that. Instead, we need to throw out the old playbook. As the Ford Foundation president Darren Walker said, also a Black lawyer from Texas, actually. And we need to recognize that to meet institutional challenges, we need institutional responses. So we need to rethink recruiting. We need to develop and utilize rigorous new metrics for identifying the full range of qualities that predict success. We need to rethink retention and create structural mechanisms for ensuring equal access to work and relationships. We need to understand the promotion policy and to partnership or senior positions, in which we need to think long-term about what the business case means, including new and existing client relationships, and recognizing internal as well as external values. And we need to do this long before the promotion or partnership decision and extend it long afterwards. And finally, and perhaps most of all, we need new training for our leaders about what it means to lead in a diverse environment. And then we need to hold those leaders accountable for the full range of their jobs. Will this be easy? Nope. And we've been down this road before. But the forces pushing for change are urgent. COVID has underscored both the interdependence and the fragility of our society. And both the pandemic and the protests make clear that this interdependence and fragility is fundamentally linked to race and social justice. The world needs lawyers who understand the critical link between sustainability, social justice, and success, and who are building it into their own institutions. And I firmly believe that this new generation will be shaped forever by this moment, the way my parents' generation was shaped by the Great Depression and World War II. And if you look at what that generation did, we have reason to be optimistic about this one. Lawyers who recognize these new realities are the ones who will best serve clients and attract the best talent. So I'll leave you with this. We face a choice, a fundamental choice. We can either retreat into our comfortable and established ways, or with the help of legal and compliance and everything else, build and expand to meet the challenges of the new future. And here's one thing history has taught us. Fortune favors the bold. So I urge us all at this moment to be bold. And I thank you for your time. Thank you.
Professor Wilkins, your remarks have been superb, insightful, incisive in outlining the challenges and the pathways of opportunity as well that we all face. Your remarks have been so appreciated by our entire audience and so appropriate for the Bracewell Distinguished Lecture in Racial and Social Justice. Thank you, Professor Wilkins, for this delight.